to give you an introduction to Ella Torrey. If you were, and she's to my right, to your left. If you were in this program last year, you met her. And by popular demand, a lot of people asked to bring Ella back again for this year. And since she lives maybe 15 minutes from where I am, I had a good way to reach out to her, and it didn't take long at all. She didn't resist, but she said, sure, I'll be glad to come back. But here are some opening remarks about Ella that I put together for everybody for today. If you were in this conference last year, you most certainly will remember her. If you don't know her at all, take special notice to my introduction of Ella, as it will set the tone for what it is that we're doing here today. Ella Torrey was a personal assistant to Eleanor Roosevelt. This happened after World War II, after President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. This was at the beginning of the development of the United Nations. And this was when Ella met Eleanor. Ella Torrey became a primary source on some of the early history of the United Nations. Her work in the international arena would eventually span well more than 50 years. Until she went to college, her dreams were elsewhere. Ella was an aspiring dancer. She wanted at one time to be a rockette in New York City. She didn't know I was going to say that.
No, I didn't.
But in college, things often happen to give a heartfelt focus to life, and that happened to Ella. In college, she became dedicated to being a global citizen and got involved in world events. Ella started her UN experience in 1949, working at the U.S. mission to the UN as an information officer. She wrote classified and unclassified reports on UN meetings of the Security Council, General Assembly, and committee meetings. These reports were part of the information and background needed to formulate U.S. policies on issues then, such as the Arab-Israeli conflict, German unification, and Chinese representation at the United Nations. She was then given a position to assist Eleanor Roosevelt, who had been appointed by President Truman as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations. Ella handled correspondence, edited and scheduled speeches, and briefed visitors and the foreign press. Her job also included accompanying Mrs. Roosevelt to meetings. So please welcome Ella Torrey to talk with you about the person who gave us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, thank you, Wayne. That's enough. I have Ella, as you figured out, and I came over this morning with Wayne from Philadelphia. But over 66 years ago, at 3 a.m. in the morning of December 10th, 1948, in Paris, France, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly, with 8 abstentions. The Soviet Union and the 5 bloc members that it's controlled, which made 6. Saudi Arabia abstained because it was concerned about the right to change religion. And South Africa abstained because apartheid was still the law in their country. As a young reporter for a Chicago Tribune newspaper, I watched as Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, Mrs. Roosevelt was 5 feet 11 inches tall, 64-year-old, an American delegate. She received a standing ovation at 3 o'clock in the morning. When this widow of Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States from 1933 to 1945, When she had been appointed to the UN delegation, she was denounced as an emotional, rattle-brained woman. The author of these words, a very well-known senator, later confessed at a luncheon with Mrs. Roosevelt that he had regretfully eaten his words many times. But Mrs. Roosevelt often wrote and often said, women in public life need to develop skins as tough as a rhinoceros's hide. I heard her say this a number of times because in less than a year, I was hired by the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and one of my jobs was as public information officer for Mrs. Roosevelt. Working many days and many evenings during the next years, I quickly learned that Mrs. Roosevelt was tough, she was savvy, and she was a very caring person. A political saint, one magazine called her. And she was smart. When preparing to debate Vyshinsky, for example, and Vyshinsky was the Russian ambassador, smart as he could be, he was one of the top lawyers of Russia. And he was also he was capable of great wit and great ridicule of people and their ideas. But when Mrs. Roosevelt was going to debate him, she would rehearse, and she'd get her arguments and the U.S. arguments all lined up. And then she would rehearse with a State Department aide acting as Vyshinsky. But she often, during those days of the human rights debates, she would ask the delegates to come to her home, hoping that they would get to know each other and exchange views off the record and make life a little easier in the meetings that we were holding. Growing up very shy and lonely, Mrs. Roosevelt praised her husband always for teaching her the pleasure and the success of reaching out informally to people. But only once, she told me, had such an effort seemed to move a Soviet delegate. After dinner and music at her New York apartment, Ambassador Alexei Pavlov waited until his aide went to get their coats. He then whispered to Mrs. Roosevelt, "Madam, you like the music of Tchaikovsky? So do I." That was the only message that she got that evening. But she also cared deeply for American traditions, and this is a funny story. She understood that the United Nations, you can't at the United Nations, whether you have 51 countries that you had in the beginning or 193 that you have today, you can't observe everybody's holidays because there would be no meetings at all. So during the Paris meetings in 1948 on human rights, Mrs. Roosevelt, there were two meetings were scheduled on Thanksgiving Day, but Mrs. Roosevelt figured out she could have a Thanksgiving dinner between the first and the second meeting for her staff, her American staff. She ordered 2 large turkeys from the U.S. Embassy commissary to be roasted by the French hotel chef. The hour came. The waiters brought in the 2 cooked birds on great big trays, and a gentleman guest later commented, the turkeys still had their feet on, sticking high up in the air. But whether hosting, speaking, or writing, Mrs. Roosevelt looked at human rights as both universal and very personal. She often gave over 150 speeches a year. Yeah, many offered free to support her charitable organizations. But when asked to speak by a professional speakers bureau, she would always check, or have me check or someone check, to make sure that she was being offered the going rate. Because she always said, women will be second-class citizens until they receive equal pay for equal work. And as a delegate, she championed Article 23 of the Declaration, paragraph 2, which states, everyone without discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. For every one of us, human rights are personal and universal. But you know, human rights did not begin in 1948 with Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. Over 2,500 years ago, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, declared, quote, people are free to live in all regions. I prevent slavery and I prohibit exchanging, men and women as slaves. Such traditions should be exterminated the world over. The Human Rights Declaration itself has been translated into 300 languages. It recognizes, as many of you know, that the inherent dignity, equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Unquestionably, the Declaration has lent wings to the fall of colonial empires, spurred collapse of totalitarian regimes, influenced the constitutions after World War II, and has helped end legal apartheid in South Africa. But look around us. Just look around us. Human rights abuses are everywhere. 27 million people today live in slavery. 1 billion people of our 7 billion world cannot read or write. And torture is commonplace throughout the lands. I read recently that a German human rights organization is considering filing war crime charges against the torture programs during U.S. President Bush's administration. And right now, a UN Special Envoy on Human Rights is presenting to the Human Rights Council in Geneva a very critical report rebuking Iran for torture, persecutions, and executions. So where do we begin? Where do we begin to teach peace and human rights? I think you really begin right at home, in your school, in your neighborhood. When Mrs. Roosevelt did not have a formal luncheon to go to in this building of the delegates' dining room, she would say to me, quick, let's go to the delegates. We would go to the cafeteria, the UN cafeteria. She would carry her own tray, and we would sit and eat with secretaries, translators, clerks, everybody and she would have a great time, and they would enjoy it, and we would enjoy it. Individuals of different races, creeds, and occupations in this building. Those were the first steps, and they are the first steps in basic human rights awareness. Learning about ourselves and others, listening, recognizing differences and common goals. When we talk about how you start doing this, I always say the first thing to do is get yourself a copy of the Human Rights Declaration. Teachers can get them through your library, through the computer, through a UN agency in your country, or off the internet. In introducing the 30 Articles of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations, and every individual and every organ of society shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms. That is what the 30 articles are introduced by, those words, that they will be strive by teaching and education to promote respect. As educators, all of you are the leaders, and you can make a difference. Once again, I learned a lesson from Mrs. Roosevelt. One evening, being driven home from a reception out in the country, I asked her what accomplishment in her life had meant the most to her. I was simply stunned when she answered without hesitation, making the first hockey team at my English boarding school. In her mid-teens, both parents gone, a tall, awkward girl was sent to an English boarding school with an exceptional headmistress. Learning French, living with other students, and making the first hockey team gave her a confidence and perhaps the beginnings of a woman known as the First Lady of the world. You might begin, all of you, in teaching this, you might begin by asking what human rights your students or your associates, what do they know? When they ask this question, most of the 30 human rights, people can only think of 2 or 3. They think of equal pay, they think of the right to marry, and the right to life and liberty. As you study the Declaration, look around for the special experiences to foster understanding of other rights. The right to nationality, to an education, to rest and leisure, and to freedom of opinion and expression. And as you seek to bring the world into your classroom, check the websites. People don't think so often. There are 3,000 non-governmental organizations connected to the UN and the Economic and Social Council. Like, for example, www.youthforhumanrights.org, which offers a package, a very good package, of films, booklets, and even an anti-bullying musical video. There are, as I said, over 3,000 of these connected to the UN and the Economic and Social Council. And they go from A to Z. You can go from African Action on AIDS to Zimbabwe Freedom from Hunger. These agencies offer understanding and support for the rights listed in the 30 articles of the Declaration. And as a follow-up, keep in touch with Wayne Jacoby and his Global Education Motivators for unique opportunities for action on human rights and our responsibilities. In our interdependent world, but close to home, check into groups that welcome foreign guests to your country. A university, foreign businesses, museums, government offices. And for fun, I must always say that one of the most enjoyable things I ever did was run a Model UN General Assembly. Model UNs, there are over 500,000 students in 23 cities around the world have acted in these sessions. The students assume the roles of as many of the 193 UN members as possible. You might even be able to experiment with the UN's simultaneous translations. If I were speaking to you in a UN meeting today, my words, my English words, would be instantly translated by interpreters sitting around in the booth into Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish. So you can try, and sometimes they have done that in some of the meetings. But before the actual sessions start, the students all contact the UN delegations here in New York or in their home countries. And they plan their agendas and they prepare their speeches. The topic might even be a call for action from a Human Rights Council. There is no better way to learn about the United Nations than to have a model UN. A model UN, it can be a General Assembly or it can be a meeting of the Security Council. You can choose what the students want to do. Usually the students return to school very impressed by what the UN and what they have accomplished. Food for 90 million, what the UN has accomplished. Food for 90 million people in 73 countries. Vaccinations for almost 60% of the world's children. They combat climate change, and there are 120,000 peacekeepers in 16 operations now on 4 continents. And we might add, they are still trying to solve the Israel-Palestine issue, the Syrian conflict, wars in Africa, the Indian-Pakistan feud over Kashmir, to name a very few. As Mrs. Roosevelt always said, it isn't enough to talk about peace. One must work at it. The future we all seek, we all want, is a better world, and each one of you can work to create this through peace and human rights education. Thank you all for joining this conference, and good luck to everybody. Thank you.